The European Union has charged Google with abusing the dominant position of its Android mobile operating system. EU antitrust regulators said that by requiring mobile phone manufacturers to pre-install Google Search and, of course, the Google Chrome browser, the U.S. company was denying consumers a wider choice of mobile apps and, of course, stifling innovation. Now, the bloc said about 80% of smart mobile devices in Europe and, of course, the world run on Android. The EU also charged the U.S. company with giving financial incentives to manufacturers and, of course, network operators to pre-install Google Search exclusively on devices. Google, which has 12 weeks to respond to the charges, said in a statement that Android was a remarkable system based on open source software and open innovation.
It is just about a year ago I was here to announce that we opened an antitrust investigation into some of Google's business practices relating to the Android operating system and Google's applications running on Android. The preliminary conclusions from our investigation is that these practices breach EU competition law.
Now, Kevin Ozebek now joins us in Brussels to give us some insight into Google's alleged breach of EU competition laws. Now, Kevin, welcome to the show. The EU says that this investigation is distinct and, of course, separates from its ongoing formal investigation of the company under EU antitrust rules. Then what exactly was the genesis of this particular complaint?
Well, today the EU took specific issue with the Android mobile phone operating service. Now, for those of you who aren't familiar with the Android service, this is an operating service used exclusively for cell phones that was developed and owned by Google. And EU commissioners say their issue with this is that Android has such a huge dominance in the mobile phone market, and that Google really takes advantage of that dominance to stifle its competitors and to also give an unfair advantage to European consumers. Specifically, the EU takes issue with the fact that Google has these specific deals, these specific relationships with mobile phone makers, and that many mobile phone models exclusively are preloaded with Google Android apps, and that even some phones have Android-specific apps that only can be used on that phone. For example, if a European consumer buys that phone and tries to download a competing app, that phone will not allow those apps to download. So that's why the EU says with the market dominance of Android and with some of these deals that Android has with cell phone makers, that's not fair to other companies that have mobile operating systems, and that's also not fair to the European consumer because European consumers have so few mobile operating services they can choose from.
Now, Kevin, Google's response to the EU's objections was basically, we look forward to working with the EU Commission. Now, do you think we will see the company defending its position, of course, changing its practices in the next 12 weeks?
Well, that 12-week time frame comes from the EU. The EU wants to see Google make some changes within 12 weeks. Well, that's a good question. We're just going to have to wait and see what Google is going to do. After the European Union made this announcement today and talked about this investigation, Google came out and issued a statement saying that, in fact, the Android operating system is good for competitors and is good for European consumers. And that's because Google makes the argument that so many app developers can sell their apps that they develop and that they make through the Android store. Well, if Google doesn't make any changes within 12 weeks, one or both of two things can happen. The EU can decide to slap Google with a very hefty fine, or the EU can say that if Google does not make any changes when it comes to its Android mobile operating phone business, that it will prevent it from doing business in the EU states. So now we're just going to have to wait and see how Google responds to this and if it makes any changes over the coming weeks.
Well, Kevin, right now about 80% of smart mobile devices actually run on Android. Its dominance is not just in Europe but globally as a whole. Now, is Google facing similar resistance in other markets such as the US or even Asia?
Well, it is, and talk about such a strong, dominant figure in this particular industry. Just some other countries, just to name a few other countries that have taken issue with Google in the past. They include countries like Brazil and South America, South Korea over in Asia, and of course the U.S. has also opened up a number of investigations into Google. Back in 2008, the U.S. government decided that Google cannot run Google search ads on its competitor's website, yahoo.com. Of course, Yahoo being another huge player in the search engine industry and one of Google's main competitors. So that was a loss for Google there when it comes to that U.S. ruling. But just 3 years ago, the U.S. ended up closing its investigation, this one particular investigation into Google. There were some accusations back then that Google was altering search results to make some of its competitors not look so good and to put a bad light on them. Well, in that particular investigation, the U.S. found those claims unfounded and ended closing that investigation without any harm or any penalty to Google.
Quite interesting. Well, thank you so much, Kevin, for those insights. Of course, Kevin Ozebek joining us in Brussels.